Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi and, well, to be frank, I'm not usually a big fan of the way Wizards of the Coast chooses to cover the Pro Tour events from an entertainment perspective. I also don't often find that there's a lot of good takeaways for the budget community because, let's face it, Pro Tour isn't exactly bound by budget. They're there because they're willing to invest in the cards. But this time around, I wanted to take the opportunity to not only recognize Seth Manfield's win and congratulate the entire top 8, as well as really the entire field at Chicago, because let's face it, playing at this level is an accomplishment in and of itself, regardless of who takes the trophy. This time around, I also think there are a lot of good takeaways for us as a budget community to inform our decisions as we continue to grow our collection here over the next 6 months or so. But before we get into all that, take just a moment to like, comment, and subscribe, because that kind of thing really keeps this boat moving. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Alright, so let's start off by talking about why I think this event has something to say for us budget players. And first off, I think the event and the broader meta that it represents appears to be fairly healthy, fairly balanced. The only real standout here is it Phoenix coming in just under 18%. Big standards like Lotus Field Combo, Creativity, things like that are all spotlight decks, but they're not really taking over the format like we occasionally see other decks, other formats being warped by single things. And in fact, I think the only warping factor here is the Amelia combo, which was only about 6.5% of the meta. But I do think it informed a lot of deck and particularly sideboard decisions within the sub-metas. Overall, we had nearly 16% of non-spotlight decks. Secondly, you'll also notice that there are a lot of decks missing here that we have discussed as a budget community before. Things like Mono Blue or Azorius Spirits, Mono White Humans, Mono Red, and of course the Mono Green Devotion decks. Not really in the spotlight here at all. Although if you dig into that broad 15.5% other category, you will find that all of those decks did show up to some degree. You will also very often hear me talk about the kind of low-key importance of making sure you have solid collections at lower rarities, because very often these cards end up being more important than you expect them to be, both in the short term and in the long term. And this particular event was no exception, with at least half a dozen Murders of Karlov Manor lower rarity cards showing up and having impact on the format. In fact, the most prevalent card by far in the entire event was the new No More Lies uncommon for Murders. This card had 181 copies at a little over 250 total decks, and all of them, if I remember correctly, were main deck cards, no sideboards here. Believe it or not, I've been around Arena for so long that I remember when it was nothing but standard. And in fact, when rotation happened, they had no choice but to delete the cards because they were kind of useless since you could only play standard. But of course, since then, the Eternal formats available on Arena have grown by leaps and bounds. In fact, it kind of seems like we have a new one every time we turn around now. But in order for me to recommend an Eternal deck as being budget friendly, it's got to meet one basic criteria. At least half of the non-land cards in the deck need to come from those recent and easily accessible sets like Standard, Alchemy that is in rotation, or eternal direct releases that have been done during that budget year, i.e. since the most recent rotation. And once we have that easy, accessible basis, I will try and assist you in making small, strategic, and versatile investments in your Eternal collection so that your wildcard pool continues to grow while your Eternal options do as well. And hey, I guess we got to talk about Rakdos vampires in the room here. A lot of people are actually attributing this deck list to Reed Duke, but it was Seth Manfield that took it not only to the top table, but took the trophy with it. So a significant deck, to say the least. Channel Fireball showed up with it almost exclusively within that team. Beyond that, this deck does meet my criteria of about, well, more than 50% of the deck being newly available cards. And also the older cards that are in it tend to be fairly tried and true staples. There's not a lot of new tech going on here. But that having been said, almost across the board, this is higher rarity cards. So it's a little tough for me to really call this budget friendly. Although it does check a lot of the boxes that I look for. More concernedly on this is if you look at this deck in Explorer right now, it's only about 1% of the meta and only pulling about a 52% win rate in Explorer. So I think this might be a case of pros doing what pros do very well. They read the meta and they showed up with the right deck at the right time, because while this deck might continue to be a force in the meta, I think its future, particularly in Explorer and for budget players, remains to be seen. One of the most interesting, noteworthy pieces of tech to come out of Chicago was the Boros heroic decks surpassing Boros Convoke for, well, the first time in, I don't know, maybe 6 months or so. And 10 out of those 12 Boros heroic decks embraced Fugitive Codebreaker as a new piece of technology. More interestingly, though, the guy who not only made the top 8 with a Boros heroic deck and took second place overall did not embrace that new technology and instead went with the more budget-friendly traditional list that runs almost exclusively commons and uncommons. And this, I think, is where the real message of this event lies. And this is the deck, more or less, that I think we need to be on as a budget community that is looking to step into and be reasonably competitive in the Explorer format. Right now, Boros Heroic is trending at a roughly 3% of the Explorer meta and is showing off a win rates of 56 to 59%. So really in that sweet spot of warranting future development for us as budget players. All right, so what do you say we take a look at the deck here? And I want to start with a couple of broad strokes here when it comes to this deck. The community is kind of split, nearly 50-50, but more like 45-55 about the inclusion of Jangotha the Wellspring. A little more than half are including it right now, but it is really the only non-rare land that we're going to talk about today, and the deck functions perfectly well without it. It's just a little less resilient without it. So, you know, manage your wild cards, manage your expectations, and decide for yourself which version of the deck you want to use. The other broad stroke that I wanted to talk about is the deck list that I'm going to be including will include the sideboard as presented at Pro Tour Chicago. Not because I think you necessarily need to be running this deck in best of 3, and obviously in best of 1 there's absolutely no need to craft the sideboard, But if you are looking to reduce some of your lower rarity wildcard expenditures, looking at those cards that show up in the sideboard are certainly a good place to start, and you might have some cards that are perfectly workable already in your collection as represented there. Now, as I said, this deck is very budget friendly, and in fact, 7 of the non-land slots are made up of cards either directly from Standard or introduced onto Arena within the last year. So a lot of things that you should have very good access to. Defiant Strike is the only non-standard one, and that, of course, was in Khans of Tarkir, and is also a reprint. So there's really no reason that most people shouldn't have it. It's also a cantrip, so if for some reason you don't, it is a solid investment in the archetype. Homestead Courage, Lauren's Escape, Ancestral Anger, Monastery Swift Spear, Monstrous Rage, and Illuminator Virtuoso are probably all very familiar from Standard. Now, of course, it wouldn't be an Explorer deck as opposed to a Standard deck without a few additions. Favorite Hoplite, of course, is the signature card for the deck with the heroic ability. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Favorite Hoplite, put a +1/+1 counter on it and prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn. This is the powerhouse uncommon of this deck, and this is what really makes it go. God's Willing is a 1/of, target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn, scry 1. Reckless Rage is, well, fairly recent technology for this, and I say fairly because I think it's been introduced within the last couple of years. An instant, it deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control and 2 damage to a target creature you control. Of course, Favorite Hoplite completely nullifies that damage. So it's an interesting little piece of tech there. And 10th District Legionnaire, the one true Boros card at uncommon, a 2/2 haste. Whenever you cast a spell that targets the Legionnaire, put a +1 counter on the Legionnaire and scribe 1. So it really gives you a lot of card draw selection opportunity going on there. The mana base, likewise, very, very simple. From Standard, we've got Aganja, the Sea of the Empire, of course, a 1/of Plains, and a 4/of Battlefield Forge. And as always within my decks, there's a lot of room to tweak these mana bases. And in fact, you'll see in the final version that I post, I do tweak these a little bit to try and make them a little more budget opportunity. In this next category, we've got the cards that Simon chose to play in his list. 4/of Inspiring Vantage and 3 Needleverge Pathways. Both very good dual lands in Explorer, not necessarily on my craft list, and I will actually be reducing the numbers on these and highlighting some of the other cards that might be hiding in your collection that will work just as well here. Now, that having been said, there are some things in the land base that I do think are worth crafting. Sacred Foundry, for instance. The shock lands are the premier lands in Explorer or Historic, and I think they're going to remain that way for quite some time. I think these are investments that you can feel good about if you find a deck that is working well for you. A 1/of copy of Manic Confluence, a rare land, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color, is a very solid addition to your Eternal collection in much the same way our recent Gate Standard card that is very much like a Pain land is. So it kind of follows that same line. I think having a 1/of copy of in your collection is a great idea, and obviously there are reasons that Simon included this in his second place Pro Tour deck. The other pieces of land tech, Spikefield Hazard and Jury Shelter, are both utility spell/lands. I think a 1/of in each copy or in each type is a very good addition to your collection. Simon put 2 of the hazards in his deck. I can't necessarily argue against that, But in my final version, I am actually going to be subbing one of these out for a more readily available standard legal card that I think makes the deck significantly more budget friendly in the long term. And hey, Matt wouldn't want you to forget that the link to my updated Boros Heroic deck list is down in the doobly-doo. Make sure to check it out. And hey, take a moment to like the deck list when you download it. Helps me out a lot. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.